What happens when a country music superstar walks into one of daytime television's most unpredictable roundtables, and the conversation takes a turn nobody saw coming? That's exactly what went down when Blake Shelton sat down with the ladies of The View, and what started as a friendly chat about his latest album quickly spiraled into one of the most jaw-dropping moments in talk show history. Before we dive into every word of this explosive exchange, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us whose side you're on in this debate. Trust me, you're going to have opinions. Blake walked onto that set with his usual easygoing charm, waving to the audience as they erupted in applause. The panel greeted him warmly, and for the first few minutes, everything seemed perfectly normal. They talked about his tour, his new music, and even got a few laughs talking about his life on the ranch. But then Joy Behar leaned forward with that look in her eye. The one regular viewers know means she's about to steer the ship into deeper waters. Joy started by bringing up a recent interview Blake had done where he mentioned growing up in a small town in Oklahoma and how those roots shaped his values. She asked him to elaborate, and Blake obliged, talking about community, hard work, and the kind of neighbors who'd show up at your door with a casserole if they heard you were going through a tough time. The audience seemed to appreciate the sentiment, nodding along as he painted a picture of rural American life. But Joy wasn't done. She pivoted, asking Blake if he thought those small-town values were somehow superior to the values held by people in cities. The question had an edge to it, and you could see Blake's expression shift slightly. He paused, choosing his words carefully, saying that he wasn't claiming superiority, just that different places shape people differently, and he's proud of where he comes from. He added that he's sure people from New York or Los Angeles are equally proud of their backgrounds. Joy pressed further, suggesting that when people talk about small-town values in the way Blake did, it often comes with an implicit judgment about urban communities. She asked him point-blank if he thought city folks were missing something that country folks had figured out. The tension in the room started to build. You could see the other panelists exchanging glances, and the audience had gone noticeably quieter. Blake shifted in his seat, his friendly demeanor still intact, but with a hint of defensiveness creeping in. He explained that he wasn't trying to create some kind of divide, that he spent plenty of time in big cities and has friends and colleagues from all walks of life. He mentioned his years working in Los Angeles on The Voice and how much he respects people from different backgrounds. But then he added something that would prove to be a turning point. He said that in his experience, there's something about smaller communities where people still look out for each other in ways that can get lost in bigger places. Joy jumped on that immediately. She asked him if he was really suggesting that people in cities don't look out for each other, pointing out the countless community organizations, neighborhood watches, and mutual aid networks that exist in urban areas. She brought up how New Yorkers came together after various crises, how communities rally around each other every single day. Her voice had raised slightly, and Blake's jaw tightened. Blake responded by saying that's not what he meant, but Joy interrupted, asking him what exactly he did mean then. She said that these kinds of generalizations are part of a larger narrative that paints rural America as the keeper of real American values while dismissing the rest of the country. Blake's hands were now gripping the armrests of his chair, and he leaned forward to respond. He told Joy that she was putting words in his mouth, that he never said anything dismissive about cities or the people who live in them. He pointed out that he was simply asked about his own background, and he answered honestly. Joy countered by saying that the way he framed it absolutely carried implications, whether he intended them or not. She asked him if he understood why someone might hear his comments and think he was looking down on urban communities. Blake's voice grew firmer. He said he understood that people could interpret things however they wanted, but that doesn't mean their interpretation is what he meant. He added that maybe the problem is that people are too quick to find offense in everything, instead of listening to what's actually being said. The audience reacted with a mix of gasps and scattered applause. Joy's eyes widened, and she sat back in her chair with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. She said that was an interesting perspective, especially coming from someone who just spent 5 minutes defending how sensitive and tight-knit his community is. She asked him if it wasn't a bit ironic that he's asking for understanding and careful listening while simultaneously suggesting that people who point out problematic framing are just looking for reasons to be offended. Blake opened his mouth to respond, but Joy kept going. She brought up several recent examples of public figures who made similar comments about rural versus urban values and how those comments fit into a broader political narrative. She asked Blake directly if he aligned himself with that narrative. Blake's face had gone red now, and he said he came on the show to talk about his music, not to be interrogated about his political beliefs. Joy replied that his values and his art are connected, and if he's going to make statements about community and culture, he should be prepared to discuss them. She added that this is what The View does. They have real conversations about real issues, and if he wasn't prepared for that, maybe his team should have done better research before booking him. The other hosts tried to interject, with Whoopi attempting to steer the conversation toward a lighter topic and Sarah suggesting they take a breath and reset. but Blake was already standing up. He looked directly at Joy and said that there's a difference between having a conversation and being ambushed. He told her that she twisted everything he said from the moment he started talking about his hometown, that she came into this with an agenda, and he wasn't going to sit there and be used as a prop for whatever point she was trying to make. Joy stood up as well, saying that if he felt ambushed by simple questions about his own statements, then maybe he should think more carefully about what he says in interviews. She told him that accountability isn't an ambush, it's part of being a public figure. Blake shook his head, his voice rising as he said that this wasn't accountability. It was a setup, and he was done playing along. The audience was completely silent now, every eye glued to the confrontation unfolding in front of them. Whoopi stood and placed a hand on Blake's arm, trying to calm the situation, but he gently pulled away. He thanked the other hosts for having him, but said he couldn't continue under these circumstances. Joy crossed her arms and asked if he was really going to storm off just because someone challenged him. Blake turned back to face her one more time, his voice steady but ice cold. He told Joy that she doesn't know him, doesn't know his heart, and doesn't have the right to assign motivations to him based on her own biases. He said that if this is what passes for discourse on her show, then he wants no part of it. He unclipped his microphone, handed it to a nearby crew member, and walked toward the exit. Joy called out after him, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. She asked if running away was part of those small-town values he'd been talking about. Blake stopped in his tracks, and for a moment it looked like he might actually leave despite the provocation. But instead, he turned around slowly, and the look on his face made it clear this confrontation was far from over. He walked back toward the table, not to sit down, but to stand at the edge of the set where he could address Joy directly, without the barrier of the desk between them. He told her that what she just did, that cheap shot, was exactly the problem. He said she's not interested in dialogue or understanding. She's interested in winning, in getting a reaction, in making him look bad for her audience. His voice wasn't loud anymore, but it carried a weight that somehow felt more intense than shouting. Joy responded by saying that she asked him legitimate questions about statements he made publicly. And if he can't handle that level of scrutiny, then maybe he should stick to singing and leave the commentary to people who can defend their positions. The audience gasped again, and you could see members of the production crew looking at each other with wide eyes, clearly unsure whether to cut to commercial or let this play out. Blake laughed, but it was a harsh sound with no humor in it. He said it was fascinating that Joy was lecturing him about defending positions when she'd spent the last 10 minutes misrepresenting everything he said. He told her to go back and listen to the tape, to show him exactly where he said city people were inferior or where he dismissed urban communities. He challenged her to quote him directly instead of projecting her assumptions onto his words. Joy didn't miss a beat. She said that impact matters more than intent, and if multiple people in this room interpreted his comments the way she did, then maybe the problem isn't with their listening skills. She brought up the fact that language matters, that dog whistles exist, and that public figures have a responsibility to be aware of how their words land in the current cultural climate. She asked him if he really wanted to die on the hill of pretending that talking about small-town values in contrast to everywhere else doesn't carry certain implications. Blake fired back by asking Joy if she applied that same standard to herself. He pointed out that she just implied he wasn't intelligent enough to participate in political discussions, telling him to stick to singing. He asked her if she realized how condescending that was, how dismissive of his right to have opinions beyond his profession. He said that for someone who claims to care about respectful discourse, she sure was quick to belittle someone the moment they disagreed with her. Sunny Hostin interjected, trying to bring some balance to the conversation. She acknowledged that both of them had valid points, and that maybe they were talking past each other. She suggested that Blake might not have intended any offense, but that Joy's concerns about the language used weren't unfounded either. She proposed they take a step back and try to find common ground, but Joy wasn't ready to step back. She told Sunny that she appreciated the attempt at mediation, but this wasn't a both sides situation. She insisted that Blake had made generalizations that fed into harmful stereotypes, and that he needed to acknowledge that before they could move forward. She looked directly at Blake and asked him if he could at least admit that his comments could be interpreted as divisive, even if that wasn't his intention. Blake's response was measured, but firm. He said that, of course, anything anyone says can be interpreted in multiple ways, but that doesn't mean he should have to apologize for speaking positively about his own background. He argued that there's a difference between celebrating where you come from and attacking where others come from, and he had done only the former. He added that if the mere act of expressing pride in rural culture is now considered offensive, then the problem isn't with what he said. It's with a culture that's become so hypersensitive that people can't even share their experiences without being accused of bigotry. Joy shook her head vigorously. She said that nobody was calling him a bigot, but that he was using the language of people who do promote divisive rhetoric. She explained that when politicians and pundits talk about real America or traditional values, they're often code for excluding certain groups of people. She told Blake that whether he likes it or not, His comments echoed that rhetoric, and he can't pretend to be shocked when people make those connections. Blake's frustration was palpable now. He said that Joy was doing exactly what he accused her of, putting him in a box with people he never claimed to align with, judging him by standards he never agreed to. He told her that not everyone who talks about rural life is making a political statement, that sometimes people are just talking about their actual lives. He asked her why it was so hard for her to take him at his word instead of assuming he had some hidden agenda. Joy responded by saying that in her experience, when people get this defensive about simple questions, it usually means they're uncomfortable with something in their own position. She suggested that maybe Blake's reaction was so strong because on some level he knew his comments were problematic. She told him that self-reflection isn't a weakness. It's actually a strength, and that admitting when we could have phrased something better is how we grow. Blake's voice rose again. He said that Joy was now playing armchair psychologist, analyzing his emotional state instead of engaging with his actual words. He told her that her experience isn't universal truth, and her interpretations of his motivations were nothing more than guesses dressed up as insight. He said that the real issue here is that she can't conceive of someone disagreeing with her without being either ignorant or malicious, and that says more about her worldview than his. Alyssa Farah Griffin jumped in, pointing out that the conversation had become about the argument itself rather than the underlying issue. She asked both Blake and Joy if they could acknowledge that they were both feeling attacked and maybe operating from a defensive place. She suggested that if they could reset and approach this with a bit more generosity toward each other, they might actually be able to have a productive conversation. Joy turned to Alyssa and said that she wasn't feeling attacked. She was simply holding Blake accountable for his words. She insisted that there was nothing defensive about her position, that she was being perfectly clear and direct. Blake immediately jumped on that, saying that if Joy didn't think she was being defensive, then she lacked basic self-awareness. He said that she'd been on the attack from the moment she brought up the topic, framing her questions in ways designed to make him look bad, no matter how he answered. Joy laughed and said that if Blake thought straightforward questions were an attack, then he really wasn't cut out for these kinds of conversations. She told him that this is what political discourse looks like. People challenging each other's ideas, pushing back on problematic statements, refusing to let things slide just to be polite. She said that if he wanted everyone to just nod along and affirm whatever he said, he should have stayed in his echo chamber instead of coming on a show known for tough conversations. Blake's jaw clenched. He said that there's a difference between tough conversations and hostile interrogations, and Joy had crossed that line within minutes of bringing up the topic. He told her that real discourse requires good faith on both sides, requires actually listening to what the other person is saying instead of just waiting for your turn to attack. He said that Joy had demonstrated zero good faith from the start, and that's why this conversation had gone so badly off the rails. Joy shot back that maybe the conversation went off the rails because Blake couldn't handle being questioned. She said that powerful people, especially successful men in the entertainment industry, often mistake accountability for hostility because they're not used to being challenged. She told Blake that just because someone pushes back on his statements doesn't mean they're being hostile. It means they're treating him like an adult who can defend his positions. Blake stared at Joy for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was quiet but carried an unmistakable edge. He told her that bringing his gender and success into this was a desperate move, that she was now trying to paint him as someone who can't handle strong women simply because he disagreed with her approach. He said that he's worked alongside powerful women his entire career, that he has nothing but respect for people who speak their minds, but that respect has to go both ways. He told Joy that she doesn't get to misrepresent what he says and then act like he's the problem when he objects to it. Whoopi tried once more to intervene, her voice firm, as she suggested they had reached a point where continuing wasn't productive for anyone. She looked at Blake and acknowledged that the conversation had gotten heated, then looked at Joy and said the same. She proposed they agree to disagree and move on to a different topic. Maybe circle back to Blake's music and the reason he came on the show in the first place. But Joy wasn't ready to let it go. She told Whoopi that sometimes conversations get uncomfortable because they need to, that growth doesn't happen when we shy away from difficult moments. She turned back to Blake and said that she genuinely wanted to understand his perspective, but that required him to engage with the actual substance of her concerns instead of complaining about her tone or approach. Blake let out a long breath, and you could see him wrestling with whether to continue or walk away. Finally, he spoke, his voice tired but resolute. He told Joy that he had been engaging with the substance, that he'd answered her questions repeatedly, but that she kept moving the goalposts every time he responded. He said that she asked him about his comments on small-town life. He explained what he meant, and instead of accepting his explanation or asking clarifying questions, she accused him of speaking in code and harboring divisive intentions. He continued, saying that when he pushed back on her characterization of his words, she claimed he was being defensive. When he pointed out her own condescending remarks, she said he couldn't handle being challenged. He told her that this wasn't a conversation, it was a trap, and he was done pretending otherwise. He said that he came on the show in good faith, ready to talk about his life and his work. And what he got instead was an interrogation based on assumptions and bad faith interpretations. Joy's expression hardened. She said that Blake was playing the victim when all she did was ask him to think critically about his own statements. She told him that if he felt trapped by simple questions about the implications of his words, then maybe he needed to spend more time thinking before speaking publicly. She added that this victim mentality, this idea that being questioned equals being attacked, is exactly what allows harmful rhetoric to go unchallenged in our society. Blake's hands were shaking slightly now, whether from anger or frustration or both. He told Joy that calling his objections a victim mentality was another way of dismissing legitimate concerns about how she conducts these conversations. He said that he wasn't playing victim. He was standing up for himself against someone who seemed determined to paint him as something he's not. He asked her directly, looking her in the eye, if she honestly believed he came on this show with the intention of disparaging city dwellers or promoting division. He asked her if she really thought that's who he is. Joy met his gaze without flinching. She said that intention doesn't matter as much as he thinks it does. That plenty of harm has been done throughout history by people who didn't intend it. She told him that she doesn't know what's in his heart, but she knows what came out of his mouth. And what came out of his mouth echoed talking points that are used to divide this country. She said that if he can't see that, if he can't acknowledge even the possibility that his words could be heard that way, then he is either willfully ignorant or deliberately obtuse. The silence that followed was deafening. Blake stood there, and for a moment everyone in the studio seemed to be holding their breath. Then he nodded slowly, more to himself than to anyone else. He told Joy that her assessment of him was noted, that he understood perfectly clearly that no matter what he said, she had already decided who he was and what he represented. He said that this conversation confirmed everything he'd suspected about this kind of platform, that it's not about understanding or dialogue. It's about reinforcing predetermined narratives and scoring points with your audience. He turned to the other hosts and thanked them for trying to keep things civil, acknowledging that they'd attempted to mediate even when it became clear the situation was beyond saving. He told them he respected their efforts. Then he looked back at Joy one final time and said that he hoped she got whatever she was looking for out of this exchange, whatever clip or moment she could use to prove whatever point she wanted to make. He told her that he'd learned something today too, that he'd learned exactly how these conversations are weaponized, and why so many people are afraid to speak honestly about their lives and beliefs. Joy responded that if he was afraid to have his statements examined and questioned, then maybe those statements need She told him that running away and playing victim doesn't make him right. It just makes him unwilling to engage in the hard work of introspection and growth. Blake shook his head and said that he wasn't running away. He was choosing not to participate in a conversation that was designed from the start to make him the villain. With that, he turned and walked off the set. This time, no one called after him. The camera caught Joy sitting back in her chair, arms crossed, while the other hosts looked uncomfortable and unsure how to proceed. Whoopi finally broke the silence, addressing the camera and the audience, saying that sometimes conversations don't go the way anyone hopes, but that's part of having real discussions about difficult topics. She suggested they take a break, and the show cut to commercial. The tension in that studio was unlike anything most viewers had seen on daytime television. What started as a simple question about Blake's background spiraled into a full-scale confrontation about communication, respect, intention versus impact, and the very nature of public discourse. Both Blake and Joy remained firmly planted in their positions, neither willing to give an inch. And the result was a clash that left everyone watching with strong opinions about who was right and who was wrong. So what do you think? Was Joy out of line with her questioning, or was Blake too sensitive to legitimate criticism? Did this conversation represent the worst of political discourse, or was it an honest exchange that just got heated? Make sure you subscribe to the channel and drop a comment below answering this question. Who handled this situation better, Blake Shelton or Joy Behar?